The doors of the private hospital wing burst open, and a man who had never once in his adult life allowed anyone to see him afraid was running down a hallway with his tie hanging loose around his neck, shouting for a doctor. Any doctor, while two of his own bodyguards struggled to keep pace behind him. Machines beeped somewhere down that corridor. A nurse pressed her hand flat against his chest to stop him from barreling straight into the delivery room, and for one unbearable second, Alejandro Vital, a man feared by 3 rival families and respected by every dirty cop from Knoxville to Charlotte, stood frozen outside a closed door, powerless, waiting to find out if the 2 people he loved most in the world were going to make it through the night. How does a man like that end up here? How does a woman with flour on her apron end up married to him in the first place, standing on the other side of a door he cannot force open with money or fear? Stay with me, because the answer starts in a much smaller, much quieter place than this. It starts on Gay Street in a little antique shop with a bell over the door that never quite closed all the way, and a young woman named Malene Pierce who had absolutely no idea. On the ordinary Tuesday, the story really begins that her whole life was about to be rewritten. Malene was 26 years old with soft brown eyes and thick wavy hair. She usually pinned up with whatever pencil happened to be within reach, and a gentleness about her that people mistook for softness in every sense of the word, including the ones that mattered. She was curvy, unapologetically so, the kind of woman who filled out a doorway with warmth instead of apology. And she had spent most of her adult life being underestimated by people who never bothered to look past the surface. It was a mistake. It had always been the mistake. Malene Pierce had survived losing both her parents in a single terrible night. 3 years earlier, had survived inheriting debts that weren't hers to carry, had survived learning to run a failing antique shop on her own, with nothing but grit and a head for numbers she'd never asked for. And she had done all of it with a smile that never quite reached the tired place behind her eyes, but never disappeared either. The shop belonged to her Aunt Carol. Technically, there most days it felt more like Malene's own child than her aunt's business. It sat wedged between a coffee shop and a shuttered hat store, its front window crowded with chipped teacups and gilt mirrors, and a taxidermy owl that had somehow become the shop's unofficial mascot. Malene restored furniture in the back room most afternoons, sanding down old varnish, coaxing life back into tables and chairs that everyone else had already thrown away. There was something in that work she never quite said out loud even to herself, that maybe she liked fixing broken, forgotten things because some stubborn part of her hoped somebody would do the same for her one day. Business was slow, that spring slower than it had been in years, and Malene had gotten used to the particular quiet of an empty shop on a weekday afternoon, the kind of quiet where you could hear the old clock on the far wall ticking through every single second of a day that refused to bring in a single customer. She spent those hours mostly talking to herself or to the owl whom she had named Winston sometime during her first lonely winter running the place, and who never once talked back, which she found she preferred to most people. "What do you think, Winston?" she said one gray morning, holding up a chipped porcelain shepherdess to the light, turning it slowly to inspect the crack running down its side. "Worth saving? Or too far gone?" Winston predictably offered no opinion. "You're right," Malene told him. "Everything's worth saving if you're patient enough." Carol Pierce was 61, silver-haired, endlessly warm, and lately carrying a fear in her eyes. that Malene had learned to recognize the way you learn to recognize weather before a storm actually breaks. "You've got that look again," Malene said one morning, setting a cup of coffee down in front of her aunt at the little desk they shared near the register. "The one where you're doing math in your head and none of it's adding up." Carol managed a thin smile. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Carol, it's grown up. Nothing boring, bank, nothing." Carol waved a hand like she could physically push the subject away. "Drink your coffee before it gets cold." Malene let it go because that was usually how these conversations ended, but she noticed the way she noticed everything quietly, patiently, that her aunt had started taking phone calls out on the sidewalk lately, her back to the shop window, her voice too low to carry through the glass. She noticed the way Carol flinched whenever the shop phone rang unexpectedly. She noticed the stack of unopened envelopes that had begun accumulating in the drawer beneath the register, the return addresses carefully turned face down. She found out what those calls were about on a gray Thursday afternoon when a black SUV with tinted windows the color of a held breath pulled up outside the shop and idled there just a little too long before a man stepped out of it. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, in a way that made his charcoal suit look less like clothing and more like architecture. Dark hair cut close and precise, a jaw that looked like it had never once in its whole life relaxed. He moved like a man who had never had to hurry anywhere because the world simply waited for him instead. The bell over the door rang thin and small against the sudden weight that walked in with him. Carol's face went the color of old paper. "Mr. Vittle," she said, and her voice cracked on the second word. He didn't answer her right away. His eyes moved over the shop, the dusty shelves, the mismatched furniture, the taxidermy owl watching him from the window with the flat, unimpressed patience of a man doing an inventory of something he already planned to take. Then his gaze landed on Malene standing behind the counter with sawdust on her sleeve and a rag still in her hand. And something in his expression shifted quick and almost imperceptible, like a door opening a crack before someone remembered to shut it again. "Carol Pierce," he said finally, and his voice was low, clipped, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to fill a room. "We need to talk about the loan your late husband took against this family and about what happens now that it's due." Malene set the rag down slowly. "What loan?" Nobody answered her. "1 week," the man said, looking at Carol and only Carol, as though Malene weren't standing 3 ft away with her heart suddenly hammering somewhere up near her throat. "I'll expect your answer in 1 week, Mrs. Pierce. I'd hate for this to become unpleasant." He turned to leave, and then, almost as an afterthought, his eyes flicked back once more to Malene, lingering half a second longer than politeness required before he walked out. The bell over the door rang behind him like a period at the end of a sentence. Neither Pierce woman had agreed to. He wants his answer in 7 days. His name Malene would learn over the following 48 hours of frantic, whispered explanations. From her aunt was Alessandro Vitale and the empire he ran. Legitimate on paper, considerably less legitimate underneath it, controlled more of the city's private security contracts, backroom deals, and quiet threats than any single family had any business controlling. He was 34 years old. He was, depending on who you asked, either the most respected man in 3 states or the most feared one, and usually both opinions came from the same person. What almost nobody outside his innermost circle knew, what Malene certainly had no way of knowing yet, was that Alejandro Vitale carried a wound none of his money could fix. Years earlier, after countless quiet, humiliating rounds of testing with specialists flown in under false names to protect his privacy, he had been told plainly and permanently that he would never father a child. He had built a fortress out of that grief instead of a family. He had told himself the fortress was enough, but empires like his didn't run on sentiment, they ran on succession. And lately, the wolves circling the edges of the vital family had begun to smell blood in the water. Rival families whispered that a king without an heir was a king already halfway to being replaced. His own relatives had started using words like legacy and continuity at family dinners, with a little too much enthusiasm, none more enthusiastically than his uncle Roberto, a soft-spoken, endlessly agreeable man who always seemed to know exactly the right thing to say, and who Alessandro, for all his instincts about everyone else in his life, had never once thought to be suspicious of. Alessandro didn't want a wife. He wanted, if he was honest, to be left entirely alone with his ledgers and his scotch, and the particular silence of a house too large for a single man to fill, but he understood leverage better than anyone alive, and marriage, even an empty, arranged one, could buy him room to breathe while he figured out how to hold his empire together with both hands. He hadn't expected the solution his own family handed him to walk into his life wearing a paint-stained apron and sawdust in her hair. Carol came home that night and told Malene everything in halting, guilty pieces. The old debt her late husband had taken from the Vital family years ago, a debt that had quietly ballooned with interest neither of them had understood the terms of, and the offer that had arrived along with the threat: marriage Malene to Alessandro Vital. In exchange, the debt simply disappeared along with the bank's threats and the shop's looming foreclosure, and every sleepless night Carol had spent since. "You don't have to say yes," Carol whispered, tears sliding freely down her face at the kitchen table. "I would never ask you to." "I know you wouldn't," Malene said quietly, and reached across the table to take her aunt's shaking hand. She thought about her parents that night, lying awake and staring at the water stain on her bedroom ceiling, shaped vaguely like the state of Florida. She thought about all the things they'd given up for her without ever once making her feel like a burden. She thought about Carol, 61 years old, terrified and exhausted, who had never once turned Malene away in 3 years of grief. Neither of them had fully recovered from. She thought, too, about the man's eyes in the shop that afternoon, the strange half-second flicker of something that hadn't matched the cold, clipped words coming out of his mouth, and told herself it didn't matter, that it changed nothing. She said yes before she let herself think too hard about what exactly she was agreeing to. The wedding, when it came, was small and gray and over almost before it started. 20 guests, most of them Vital family members, who watched Malene with the polite, assessing eyes of people evaluating livestock. She wore a simple ivory dress Carol had altered by hand at the sewing machine 2 nights running, staying up until well past midnight both times, refusing Malene's offers to help. Alejandro wore black because apparently the man owned nothing that wasn't the color of a closed door, and stood beside her at the altar with the composed, distant patience of someone attending a business closing rather than a wedding. Neither of them smiled. Malene kept her chin up anyway, the way her mother had taught her to when life handed her something heavier than she'd asked for. When the priest pronounced the married Alessandro's hand closed around hers, brief, formal, correct, and Malene told herself sitting in the back of the black car that carried them away from the chapel afterward that she would survive this, the way she'd survived everything else. Quietly, stubbornly, one day at a time, she expected the drive to his estate to be silent. It was mostly except once somewhere past the city limits, when he glanced sideways at her and said without any particular warmth, "You didn't cry? Should I have? Most women in your position would have not most women," Malene said, watching the hills roll by outside her window. "And I already did my crying last night alone when nobody was around to see it." He didn't answer that, but something about the set of his jaw shifted, and he didn't say anything else for the rest of the drive, though she noticed because she noticed everything that he kept glancing at her out of the corner of his eye the whole way there. She expected their first night in his house to be cold and transactional. It wasn't, and that surprised her more than almost anything else that had happened that week. The Vitali estate sat on the edge of the city, behind iron gates and a long gravel drive, a sprawling stone house with a view of hills that turned violet at dusk, its windows tall and dark, and its hallways wide enough to swallow sound whole. Malene stood alone in the enormous bedroom she'd been given, arms wrapped tightly around herself, waiting for whatever came next, a demand, an instruction, something that would finally match the reputation of the man she'd just married. Instead, Alessandro appeared in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, tie already gone, looking for the first time since she'd met him, less like an empire and more like a very tired man. "You don't owe me a child," he said without preamble, without softness, just fact laid plainly on the table between them. Malene blinked at him. Of everything she'd braced herself to hear that hadn't made the list. "You don't owe me anything," he continued, "except honesty." She didn't know what to say to that. So for a long moment she said nothing at all, and something in his shoulders eased slightly like it expected an argument, and gotten a strange kind of truce instead. "I'm not going to pretend this is a real marriage," he said, "but I won't treat you like furniture either. You have a room. You have a life here if you want to build one. I won't take what you don't offer." It was in its own blunt way the kindest thing anyone outside her aunt had said to her in longer than she could remember, and it had come from a man. Half the city was afraid to look directly in the eye. "That's a strange kind of wedding vow," Malene said finally, and something that might almost have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face before he caught it and put it away again. "I don't make vows I can't keep," he said. "Consider it the only honest one you'll get out of a man like me." Their marriage began without love. That much was true, and neither of them tried to dress it up as anything else in those first weeks, but slowly, so slowly, that neither of them could have named the exact day it started changing. It began to become something else entirely. It started, as these things often do, with food. Malene couldn't stand an empty kitchen the way other people couldn't stand silence. So within her first week at the estate, she'd taken over the enormous, criminally underused chef's kitchen and started cooking the way she'd grown up cooking. Cornbread that came out of the oven cracked and perfect green, simmered low and slow with a ham hock. A pot roast that made the entire east wing smell like somebody's grandmother's sundae. Alejandro found himself walking toward that smell most evenings, before he'd even admitted to himself that he was doing it on purpose. "You don't have to do this," he told her the first time he found her at the stove, sleeves rolled to her elbows, flour dusted across one cheekbone. "I know," she said, not looking up from the pan. "I want to." He stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, watching a woman do something purely because she wanted to. No leverage attached, no angle behind it, and something in his chest, some old locked room he hadn't opened in years, creaked slightly on its hinges. "There's a knife block right there, Mr. Vitali," Malene said without turning around, a smile tugging at her mouth. "You could make yourself useful instead of just standing there looking dangerous in my kitchen." "I don't cook. Everyone can chop an onion. I run a security empire and I run this kitchen," she said, sliding a cutting board and a knife across the counter toward him. "And in here I outrank you." He picked up the knife like it might be a trick. It took him 4 tries and one very undignified onion-related retreat from the room eyes, streaming dignity and tatters, before Malene finally took pity on him and showed him how to hold the blade properly. Her hand briefly over his, and neither of them mentioned how long that particular lesson took, or how neither of them had rushed to end it. She laughed at him more than once in those early weeks, actually laughed loud and unguarded the first time he made a dry, deadpan joke about his own security detail, insisting on tasting his espresso every morning before he was allowed to drink it. "You're telling me," she said, wiping her eyes, "that a grown man who controls half the private contracts on the eastern seaboard is afraid of his own coffee machine." "I am telling you," Alejandro said, entirely serious, "that a man in my position cannot be too careful." "Alejandra, it's a latte." "It's a vulnerability." She laughed harder, and something in him loosened at the sound of it. Unfamiliar and warm in a house that had been quiet for years before she'd walked into it. There was a Saturday not long after when Malene insisted on going to the grocery store herself instead of letting the household staff handle it, and Alessandro insisted just as firmly that she wasn't going alone. She won that particular argument by the technicality of him simply coming with her, and the two of them spent an entire baffling half-hour in the produce section while she tried to teach him the difference between a ripe cantaloupe and an unripe one. "You just press it," she said, demonstrating. "That seems unreliable." "It's not unreliable. It's called using your hands, Alejandro. I use my hands for considerably more precise work than fruit, then use your considerably precise hands to press the melon." He pressed the melon. 2 elderly women near the citrus display watched the entire exchange with open, delighted curiosity, and Malene was fairly certain, judging by the look on his face, that this was the single most undignified public moment of Alessandro Vital's adult life, and she loved every second of it. She challenged him, too, in ways nobody else in his life had dared to in a very long time. When he came home sharp and exhausted one evening after a brutal round of meetings and snapped at one of the household staff over something trivial, Madeline followed him straight into his study without knocking and told him flatly, arms crossed, that scaring people wasn't the same thing as leading them. "You don't know the first thing about how I run my business," he said, sharper than he meant to. "I know you made Martyr cry over a coffee order," Malene said, not backing down an inch. "That's not business, Alessandro. That's just being cruel to somebody who can't say anything back." He stared at her for a long moment, jaw tight, and instead of the anger she half expected, something closer to respect settled over his face. Nobody spoke to him that way. Nobody had in years. "You're right," he said finally. "Quiet. I'll apologize to her." And he did that same night, standing awkwardly in the kitchen doorway while Marta blinked at him in stunned silence, delivering an apology so stiff and formal it sounded like a hostage negotiation, complete with an offer of a raise that Marta accepted before he'd even finished the sentence. Smeline had to leave the room entirely to keep from laughing in front of him and later lying in her own bed. She found herself smiling at the ceiling for reasons that had nothing to do with the water stains. This time, weeks folded into months. Alejandro started finding reasons to be home earlier than his schedule technically required. He started without ever quite naming it out loud, standing a little closer to Madeline in rooms full of his relatives, positioning himself between her and the particular cruelty his family reserved for anyone they considered beneath them. When his cousin Vincenzo made a cutting remark at a family dinner about the shopkeeper's niece filling out her dress a little too generously for the Vitali name, Alessandra's voice dropped into a register that ended the conversation instantly and permanently. Nobody at that table made that mistake twice, and Meline, sitting quiet and composed through the entire exchange, felt something settle warmly in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. Meline began to understand piece by piece that the man everyone in the city feared was also a man who left the porch light burning when she was out late, who noticed she was tired before she said a single word about it. It had started somewhere in the space between an onion he couldn't chop and an apology he didn't know how to give, falling completely quietly in love with the wife he had never planned to choose for himself. She was falling too. She simply hadn't said it out loud yet, and some stubborn, cautious part of her wasn't sure she trusted the ground enough to. The house is quiet only in the daylight. The estate, for all its comfort, sat at the exact intersection of two rival worlds that had never made peace with each other. And Meline learned this the hard way one warm evening when Alessandra was away, meeting with a shipping contact downtown. And the household's usual armed presence had, for reasons never fully explained to her afterward, thinned out to a fraction of its normal number. A car she didn't recognize idled at the edge of the property for nearly 20 minutes before two men climbed the perimeter wall near the old greenhouse, moving fast and quiet in the failing light. Meline saw them from the kitchen window, and every instinct in her screamed to hide, to call for help, to do anything but stand there. But through years of running a struggling shop alone, of handling difficult customers and unpaid vendors, and every crisis that came her way without anyone to rescue her, had taught her something Alessandra's family had never once given her credit for. She didn't panic. She moved. She hit the household's silent alarm, hidden beneath the pantry shelf, exactly where Alejandro had shown her on her second week in the house, half joking at the time that he hoped she'd never need it. She herded the two younger staff members into the reinforced safe room off the study, locked the door from the inside, and pulled the heavy oak desk in front of it for good measure, her hands steady, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Then she waited in the dark, counting her own breaths, listening to muffled shouting somewhere out past the walls, until the sound of Alessandra's security detail finally flooding the grounds told her it was over. He arrived 12 minutes later, having broken every speed limit between downtown and the estate, and found her sitting calmly on the floor of the safe room with both terrifying staff members wrapped in her arms, like she was the one comforting them instead of the other way around. "You should have run," he said, dropping to his knees in front of her, his hands framing her face, checking her over for injuries with something close to desperation. "Running gets you caught," Meline said simply. "Hiding smart gets you found by the right people." He stared at her for a long moment, something fierce and startled moving behind his eyes, like he was seeing an entirely new dimension of the woman he'd married. "Where did you learn to do that?" 3 years of running a shop with no help and no money, she said. "You learn to think fast or you lose everything." That night, after the grounds had been cleared and the intruders identified as low-level Castellano scouts testing the estate's defenses, Alessandro sat with her long after the house had gone quiet again, her hand held loosely in both of his, and told her quietly, like it cost him something to say it out loud, that he had never once in his entire adult life trusted anyone the way he trusted her in that safe room tonight. Then, several months into their marriage, on an otherwise unremarkable Wednesday, Malene began to feel sick. It came on slowly at first, a heaviness in her limbs no amount of sleep seemed to fix, a tiredness that sat behind her eyes like sand. Then came the dizziness, sudden and disorienting, the room occasionally tilting sideways when she stood up too fast from the sewing chair in the corner of their bedroom. Then the cravings, strange and specific, dill pickles at midnight, orange slices dipped in salt, foods she'd never once cared for before. As she told herself, it was stress, a new marriage, a new house, a new family that watched her every move like she was a stranger who'd wandered too far into a life she hadn't earned. Stress could do strange things to a body, she told herself. She almost believed it. One morning, standing at the stove, making Alessandro's coffee out of pure, stubborn habit. The kitchen tilted violently on its axis, and the last thing she remembered clearly was the sound of the mug hitting the tile before the world went dark around the edges and folded in on itself. D'Alessandro found her crumpled on the kitchen floor, and something in him that had been carefully, deliberately controlled for 34 years simply broke wide open. He didn't wait for the household car. He carried her out to his own vehicle himself, ran 2 red lights, getting to the hospital. His jaw locked so tight it ached for hours afterward, one hand gripping the wheel and the other reaching back every few seconds just to make sure she was still breathing. "She's not waking up." The hospital moved fast the moment they arrived. His name alone cleared rooms and specialists in a way that would have been almost funny under any other circumstances, and Malene drifted in and out of a groggy, disoriented half-consciousness, aware mostly of the tight-controlled fear on her husband's face. It was a fear she had never once seen there before. Not even the night 3 armed men had shown up unannounced of the estate's gates. The specialist who eventually walked into the room wore the careful, measured expression of someone about to deliver news that would upend an entire family. And for one long moment, both Malene and Alejandro braced themselves for the worst version of whatever came next. "Mrs. Vitali isn't suffering from an illness," the doctor said slowly, glancing between them. "She's pregnant." The silence that followed felt almost physical, like something you could reach out and touch. "That's impossible," Alessandra said, and his voice cracked audibly on the last word. The very first crack Malene had ever heard in it in all the months she'd known him. The doctor, unbothered, calm in the particular way of someone who delivered impossible news for a living, explained gently that Alessandro's previous diagnosis had never meant pregnancy was strictly categorically impossible, only that the odds had been extraordinarily, vanishingly low. "Extraordinarily unlikely," the doctor repeated. Patient was simply not the same thing as impossible. Alessandre turned slowly to look at Malene, who was already crying, one hand pressed flat against her stomach, as though she could confirm the news through touch alone. He crossed the small room in 3 strides and took her hand in both of his, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the terrifying, unshakable Alessandro Vitali had absolutely nothing left to say. He simply held on and let her cry and pressed his forehead to hers. And somewhere underneath all of it, Malene felt him shaking too, just slightly, just once, in a way she suspected he would deny for the rest of his life if she ever brought it up. "A daughter," the nurse said later, checking figures on a chart. Though it was far too early to know that for certain, and Alejandro looked at her so sharply that the poor woman actually took a step back. "Statistically speaking," she added quickly. "Just statistically write it down anyway," Alessandra said, and Malene, still half laughing through her tears, thought that might have been the single most ridiculous sentence she'd ever heard leave his mouth, and loved him a little more for it. For a while, joy was the only thing in the room, but the pregnancy from nearly the beginning was not an easy one. Given Alessandro's medical history, the specialists classified it high risk almost immediately. And within weeks, Malene had developed dangerously elevated blood pressure that the doctors monitored with visible mounting concern at every appointment. Alessandro, who'd spent his entire adult life controlling every variable in his empire down to the smallest detail, found himself confronting something he could not simply intimidate or negotiate into submission. And he responded the only way he knew how, by rearranging his entire organization around her care. He brought in the top maternal fetal specialist on the East Coast and put her on retainer. He set up a private hospital suite on permanent standby, fully staffed day and night. He canceled meetings that would have been unthinkable to cancel a year earlier, and when Dominic Russo, his oldest and most trusted KPO, gently suggested that a man in his position couldn't simply drop everything for a doctor's appointment, Alessandro looked at him with an expression that ended that particular conversation permanently. "Watch me," he said, and left the room. Then the second shock arrived, and it landed far worse than the first. Someone inside the family, someone with direct access to Malene's private medical records, leaked her pregnancy to the press. It hit the local papers first, a little headline about the impossible heir of the Vitala Empire, and within days it had spread through the city's underworld with the speed of spilled gasoline, reaching exactly the kind of people who should never, under any circumstances, have known. A pregnancy that should have stayed private, sacred theirs alone, became instead a matter of open, citywide speculation, and worse, a matter of urgent strategic interest to rival families who had spent years quietly assuming Alessandro Vital would eventually die without an heir to inherit what he'd built. The Castellano family, old rivals of the Vitals, going back 2 generations, a feud older than either Alejandro or Malene, began circling almost immediately, treating the unborn child less like a baby and more like a chess piece that threatened to permanently tip the board. Threats arrive first as insinuation, then as something closer to open warning. Alejandro doubled security around the estate overnight. What had once been merely a guarded house became within a week something closer to a fortress, armed men stationed at every gate, cameras added to every hallway. Malene's every movement outside the property now escorted by 2 men with earpieces and no sense of humor. Someone close to them had done this, someone who had known things only family should ever have known. Malene, largely confined to bed rest by then and unable to do much of anything physical, threw herself into the one thing she still had some control over. She started going through the family's old correspondence boxes and boxes of decades-old letters and ledgers that Carol's antique restorer instincts couldn't help but organize by hand, even flat on her back, propped up with pillows, looking for anything that might explain who had betrayed them. She wasn't hunting for a criminal case. She was mostly just looking for something to occupy her hands and her mind. Some way to keep the fear at bay for a few hours at a time. What she found instead changed absolutely everything. Buried deep in a decade-old folder of correspondence between Alejandro's late father and various family members, Malene found a long, patient pattern of letters from Roberto Vitali, Alessandro's soft-spoken, endlessly agreeable uncle, the concerned relative who'd spent years quietly stoking fears about succession at every family dinner. That read less like family devotion and more like a careful, methodical campaign, letters discussing offshore accounts. Nobody else in the family had ever been told about. Letters referencing private, undisclosed meetings with the very specialist who had originally diagnosed Alessandro's infertility. Letters written in the careful, hedging language of a man positioning himself for years to inherit control of an empire the moment it became clear his nephew would never have a family of his own. It wasn't a rival family. It had never once been the Castellanos. It was blood. Malene sat very still on the study floor, with the letters spread out around her hands trembling, and understood with sudden sick clarity that the man who had smiled at her across every family dinner, who had brought her flowers the week she first arrived to the estate, who had called her niece in a tone she'd genuinely mistaken for warmth, had spent years quietly working to ensure Alessandro would die without a family of his own to protect, and that the leak to the press had never come from outside the walls at all. Her hands were shaking so badly it took her 3 tries to dial his number. He came running. He read through the letters twice in total silence, his face going very still in the particular way Malene had learned over these last months meant he was more dangerous than she had ever seen him. He didn't shout. He didn't break anything, though the muscle jumping in his jaw suggested he badly wanted to. He simply stood, straightened his jacket with 2 sharp, deliberate movements, and told her in a voice gone quiet and terrible and calm that he needed to speak with his uncle. "Let me come with you," Malene said. "Absolutely not. Not in your condition." "He tried to erase your whole future, Alessandro. I'm not sitting upstairs while you handle it alone." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face, some old stubborn instinct to keep every hard thing at arm's length from the people he loved, finally visibly gave way. "Fine," he said, "but you sit, and you let me talk first." Alessandro assembled the family that same night. Every capo, every cousin, every voice that carried weight in the empire his father had built. Under the guise of an emergency meeting about the leak to the press, Roberto arrived exactly as expected, smooth and composed, already performing outrage on Alessandra's behalf about the violation of the family's privacy, shaking his head with theatrical concern. Alessandro let him talk. He let him perform that concern for a full deliberate 2 minutes before he set the letters down on the table between them one by one, unhurried like a man laying out a losing hand of cards his opponent hadn't realized he was already holding. The room went completely, absolutely silent as the truth settled over it. Roberto's composure cracked in real time, the concerned uncle mask sliding away to reveal something colder and older underneath something that had apparently been sitting there quietly for years, hiding in plain sight at every single holiday dinner, every christening, every family funeral. You would have let me spend my whole life believing I was broken, Alessandro said, and his voice, low and level, was somehow far more frightening than shouting could ever have been. You would have let me believe I had nothing left to build, nothing left to leave behind so that you could take it out from under me. Roberto didn't bother denying it. There wasn't much point, not with his own handwriting spread across the table in front of 30 witnesses who had known him their entire lives. What happened to Roberto Vitali in the days that followed was handled the way these things were always handled in that particular world, quietly, thoroughly, and without further discussion. And the details were never something Malene asked about or particularly wanted to know. What mattered in the end was that it was over. The internal war that had been fought in whispers and shadows for years finally definitively ended, and the empire, for the first time in longer than Alessandro could remember, had no enemy left hiding inside its own walls. Months later, on a warm spring afternoon, with the windows open and the smell of magnolia drifting in from the garden, Malene went into labor 3 weeks earlier than expected, and the two of them found themselves right back where the story began. A hospital corridor, a locked door, and a man who had faced down armed men without flinching, utterly undone by the sound of his wife's voice on the other side of a wall he couldn't force open. The delivery had its share of frightening moments. The doctors watched her closely the entire time, given everything that had come before, and Alejandro barely left her side for 18 straight hours once they finally let him in. His hand locked around hers through every single contraction, his usual composure entirely visibly gone. At one particularly hard stretch, gray-faced and gripping her hand too tightly, he leaned down and whispered low enough that only she could hear it, that he had negotiated with armed men and stared down loaded guns without his pulse ever once changing, and none of it had prepared him for this. "You're doing wonderfully," he told her, voice unsteady. "You're squeezing my hand so hard I'm going to need a doctor for that too." Malene gasped between contractions, and even in the middle of it all, even through the pain, she laughed. And he laughed too, shaky and disbelieving, and somewhere in that laughter, the fear loosened its grip on both of them, just enough to keep going. In the end, the baby arrived crying and furious and perfectly entirely healthy, with a full head of dark hair, and Malene swore afterward, her father's exact scowl stamped across her tiny face. They named her Isabella, the mansion that had felt for so many years before Malene ever walked into it like a cold and echoing museum of a house filled almost overnight with an entirely different kind of noise. The sound of a baby's laughter down long marble hallways of Malene humming half-remembered lullabies while she rocked her daughter to sleep of Alejandro Vital, feared by 3 rival families and half the East Coast's dirty cops, learning to swaddle a newborn with the exact same fierce-focused intensity he'd once reserved for negotiating multi-million-dollar security contracts. "You're holding her like she's an unexploded device," Malene told him one night, watching him cradle Isabella with almost comical, painstaking care. "She is considerably more dangerous than any device I've ever handled," Alejandro said, entirely serious. And Malene laughed so hard she woke the baby up, which led to 20 more minutes of both of them trying badly to get her back to sleep, whispering and giggling in the dark like 2 teenagers who'd gotten caught sneaking in past curfew. At a small private family celebration on the estate's back terrace weeks later, string lights strung between the old oak trees and Carol crying happily into a glass of wine nearby, Alessandro stood holding his daughter against his chest, while Malene watched from beside him, her hand resting lightly against his arm. "They forced you to marry me," he said quietly, watching Isabella's small fist curl around his finger. "Because they thought you could give me an heir." Madeline smiled, soft and a little tearful, and said nothing because she could tell he wasn't finished yet. He took her hand in his, the same gesture as their very first night together, except everything about it had changed completely in the months between then and now. "But they were wrong," he said. He looked down at Isabella, asleep against his shoulder, and his voice caught just slightly, in a way Malene knew she would remember for the rest of her life. "You didn't give me an heir," he said. "You gave me a family." The Curvy woman, who had been forced into a loveless marriage with a mafia boss everyone believed was infertile, never once expected her mysterious sickness to reveal the greatest surprise of all. She hadn't entered his life to fulfill his family's expectations of her. She had entered it in the end to become the woman who finally gave a ruthless, guarded man a reason to live for something larger than power itself, a reason with soft brown eyes just like her own. Sleeping peacefully in her father's arms under a string of warm terrace lights, safe for the first time in generations from every shadow that had ever threatened to swallow this family whole. If this story made you feel something tonight, I want to know exactly which part it was. If you think Malene made the right call that gray Thursday afternoon in the shop, saying yes to a man she barely knew to save the aunt who raised her, tell me in the comments below. And if this is your first time here, welcome, because there is always another story waiting behind that.